Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a partner pair from Commander 2020, Nikara Lair Scavenger and Yannik Scavenging Sentinel. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. Other ways you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. Patrons get early access to scheduled videos on YouTube, and higher tier patrons get access to the VIP section of my Discord server as well. You can find a link to that down in the description too. In fact, patrons got a chance to see this video earlier. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Nikara is a 2/2 human cleric with menace for 2 generic and 1 black. She has a triggered ability that draws you a card at the cost of 1 life whenever another creature you control with a counter on it leaves the battlefield. Notice that this doesn't specify the type of counter, and creatures can leave the battlefield by other means than dying, so she definitely helps in getting draws while the deck's engines are at work. She also partners with Yannik, which is why they can share the command zone. Yannik is a 3/3 hyena beast with vigilance for 2 generic, 1 green, and 1 white. It has an enter the battlefield ability where you can exile a creature you control until Yannik leaves the battlefield. When you do, you can distribute X +1/+1 counters among target creatures where X is that creature's power. This is a core aspect of the deck. Yannik exiles a cheap fatty for value, distributing at least 1 +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures and the rest of them onto Nikara, who has menace, or other creatures with better evasion. Since this is the main focus of the deck, let's see what the best creatures for the strategy are. As I just mentioned, we're using Yannik exiling a fatty to make our entire table huge. That means that the creature has to be cheap. We can't just include a bunch of expensive creatures in the deck. Hopefully, creatures cheap enough to be cast before Yannik, or at least creatures worth it to wait a bit and then cast Yannik afterwards. So let's first see the cheaper creatures that can be cast before Yannik. Hunted Horror, Lovestruck Beast, Lupin Prototype, Phyrexian Soul Gorger, Rotting Register, and Sheltering Ancient can all be cast before casting Yannik. This is strictly in terms of curve, since you can really cast anything before casting Yannik. Hunted Horror might give an opponent 2 3/3s with protection from black, but that's fine since you can choose the least troublesome opponent to give them. Then when Yannik exiles it, you get to distribute 7 +1/+1 counters for your efforts. Lovestruck Beast can be sent on an adventure turn 1 in order to get a 1/1 token. Then cast from exile on turn 3 for a 3/3 that Yannik can exile on turn 4 to distribute 5 +1/+1 counters. All this assuming no ramp beforehand. Lupin Prototype might not block or attack most of the time, but either way that's irrelevant if it gets exiled to Yannik afterwards. Phyrexian Soul Gorger might have you sacrifice a creature during your upkeep if you don't exile it with Yannik the same turn. That's fine since you're going to then distribute 8 +1/+1 counters when you do. Rotting Aegisaur puts you in a similar predicament but with discarding instead. Again, not a problem since you'll be then distributing 7 +1/+1 counters. Sheltering Ancient's cumulative upkeep isn't so bad since you're just putting a single +1/+1 counter on an opponent's creature by the time you exile it with Yannik. It's also good to have in hand for when you fetch for Murmuring Bosk, but we'll see the lands at the end of the video. The next string of creatures are great in the deck, but if you want to make the most of them, you have to risk it for the biscuit and wait a bit before casting Yannik. Woolly Razorback and Hunter Troll cost the same as Yannik, but you still have to cast them before it. Whereas Gigantosaurus, Grothama All-Devouring, Nessian Boar, Yargle Glutton of Urborg, and Clackbridge Troll cost 1 more than Yannik. So either way you have to wait a bit until you cast them to then cast Yannik and make the most of them. These creatures give an impressive amount of +1/+1 counters amongst your creatures when exiled with Yannik, especially with most of them costing just 5 mana. If you draw any of these before casting Yannik, it's definitely worth it to cast other things beforehand, then cast these, and then cast Yannik afterwards in order to distribute those +1/+1 counters amongst the things you cast beforehand. Either way, some of these are excellent on their own, like Gigantosaurus, Yargle, and Clackbridge Troll. Even if cast in a circumstance where they're not exiled by Yannik, they're still huge threats on the board, especially when they all get trampled, which we'll see soon how. They provide an early menacing board state if we manage to ramp quickly in the early turns. The rest of the creatures mentioned are still great in the deck thanks to cards like Jared the Lich Lord. In order to make the most of creatures not being exiled by Yannik, we could just sacrifice them with Jared in order to deal a ton of damage to the entire table. If that weren't enough, if we distribute a ton of counters onto a single creature, it might be possible to kill all opponents at once thanks to Jared. That being said, it's important to give at least 1 +1/+1 counter to each creature on your battlefield when distributing +1/+1 counters. This is because Nikara has you draw a card whenever one of them leaves the battlefield. So if any of them die early for some other reason, you get that extra draw. However, it's also helpful for cards that care about +1/+1 counters like Inspiring Call. Not only will this protect our board state from a wrath if we give each creature a +1/+1 counter, but we can also draw a card for each of our creatures. Don't worry, the deck is also running Flawless Maneuver, Heroic Intervention, and Teferi's Protection, just in case we have some creatures without a counter for whatever reason. As a creature-centric deck, we have to protect our board state. However, we can fortunately consistently give our entire board a ton of +1/+1 counters thanks to Blinking Yannik. Conjurer's Closet, Eldrazi Displacer, and Angel of Condemnation are able to do this more than once, albeit the Closet is only at the beginning of our end step. But the Angel and Eldrazi can be activated at instant speed, not only to protect Yannik, but to blink it when it's most convenient for us. The Eldrazi will return it to the battlefield in that same instant, while the Angel will return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. These timings are very important depending on the situation, so keep that in mind. Restoration Angel, Charming Prince, and Felidar Guardian are creatures that blink another creature with their Enter the Battlefield trigger. Of these, the Angel is best because it has Flash and Flying. The Prince is good because it only costs 2 mana to cast. He does return Yannik at the beginning of the next end step, so again, keep that in mind. The Angel and Felidar return Yannik that same instant. What's great about this is that you can blink Yannik, exile the same creature returned or a bigger creature, and once more distribute a ton of +1/+1 counters amongst your creatures, including the new creatures on the battlefield. So if the Angel was used, for example, then you could put a ton of +1/+1 counters on it, making it quite the beater since it has Flying. Eerie Interlude and Ghostways are instants that can blink our entire board. Not only are these amazing ways to protect from board wipes, but if you get any feel bads for losing all the +1/+1 counters you've been amassing, just exile a fatty again with Yannik when they return to the battlefield. Remember that this also triggers Nikara, so you draw a card for each creature with a +1/+1 counter when it gets blinked. You can also draw a ton of cards with its deck besides the synergy provided by Nikara. I already mentioned Inspiring Call, but the deck's also running Return of the Wild Speaker, Rishkar's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty. Not only is the deck running a huge creatures that are cheap, but Yannik can make creatures even bigger, so resolving any of these spells with a huge creature on the board can overflow your hand. Since the deck is 30% creatures, it's also running Beast Whisperer, Guardian Project, and the Great Henge. The Elf might only trigger upon casting a creature, but the artifact and enchantment trigger when the creature enters the battlefield, which is just icing on the cake since we're also blinking creatures. Considering the fatties in the deck, casting the Great Henge for just 2 mana should be no problem. Either way, this card is amazing since it also doubles as a mana rock that can also give us 2 life when tapped for mana. It also puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature entering the battlefield, which is even more synergistic with the deck. This is definitely one of the best cards in the deck. We draw into so many cards with this deck that I've included Reliquary Tower and Thought Vessel. The tower doesn't take up space in the deck and the vessel doubles as a mana rock, so it also puts in work, but we'll see the rest of the mana rocks later on. The deck also makes the most of all of these interactions with even more engines and synergistic pieces. The Ozolith and Rayhan, Last of the Abzan, make sure we don't lose any counters. If any creature dies with +1/+1 counters, Rayhan lets us put that many counters on another creature, so we're technically not losing them. The Ozolith transfers those counters onto itself. With the way these cards are worded, they don't compete with each other. Rayhan doesn't move counters, the Ozolith does. So if a creature dies with a +1/+1 counter on it, they both trigger. The Ozolith gets those counters from that creature, but Rayhan puts the same amount of counters on another creature, essentially doubling how many +1/+1 counters are appearing from that creature dying. What's great about the Ozolith is that it also triggers when a creature leaves the battlefield. So any creature being blinked or delay blinked will have its counters sent to the Ozolith. Then, at the beginning of combat, you can make a ridiculously huge creature and potentially swing in for the kill. This huge creature can also be sacrificed to Jared to kill off the entire table afterwards. The creature can also be used to draw a ridiculous amount of cards with the draw spells previously mentioned, so there's synergy here abound. Pure Imaginative Rascal is another way to duplicate +1/+1 counters. If a creature would receive a +1/+1 counter, they receive an additional one. This really takes Yannick's ability to the next level. If Yannik exiles a 5/5 creature and you have 5 creatures on the board, each one gets 2 +1/+1 counters. That's nothing to scoff at. We can also duplicate counters already on creatures thanks to Karn's Bastion. Activating this at the end step of the turn before ours can go a long way if we have lots of creatures with +1/+1 counters on them. Just don't proliferate any time counters on any permanents with cumulative upkeep. As I mentioned near the beginning of the video, we don't just want huge creatures, we want huge threats. Nylea, God of the Hunt, gives trample to all of our creatures, as well as having a mana sink that can pump a potential player eliminator. If trample isn't enough for you, the deck is also running Rogue's Passage. What I usually do when playing this deck is putting the remaining +1/+1 counters from Yannick's ability onto Nikara after ensuring that each of my creatures have at least one +1/+1 counter on them. Since Nikara has Menace, she's either unblockable or takes out 2 blockers when she's attacked. But if she gets big enough, being unblockable or having trample means you can take out someone with commander damage. Swiftfoot Boots is included to protect Nikara, but Yamavaya Hollow is also included to regenerate any creature that is allowed to regenerate after a destroy effect or a creature dying to combat or non-combat damage. Alright, so that's how this deck works, like the synergistic machine it is, but the deck also has ways to disrupt opponents. Having a huge army of beaters isn't enough. Granted, Terastodon is yet another fatty in the deck, but it's also used to destroy 3 non-creature permanents. What's great about Terastodon is that if you exile it with Yannik, Yannik distributes a whopping 9 +1/+1 counters amongst creatures. However, if exiled with Yannik, then Blinking Yannik will have Terastodon return to the battlefield and destroy 3 more non-creature permanents. You can then exile it with Yannik again and save this interaction to repeat again when possible or necessary. Besides this spicy interaction, the deck's running Beast Within, Generous Gift, and Assassin's Trophy for spot removal. These instants are amazing at getting rid of anything that irks us or prevents us from fulfilling what the deck wants to accomplish. The deck's board wipes are Wrath of God, Damnation, and Toxic Deluge. These are in case other players' board states aren't able to overrun us. Fortunately, Toxic Deluge has the possibility of wiping the board except for our own creatures if they're bigger than the rest. Keep in mind also that we can give Indestructible to all of our creatures with the previously mentioned protective spells, so we can cast a Wrath and in response cast that to protect our board, and be the only ones with creatures on the table. Casualties of War is also included since it snipes 5 problems for just 6 mana. This is a great spell in a multiplayer format like this one, so it's definitely worth being included here. The deck isn't that mana hungry since there's only 4 cards that cost more than 5 mana to cast, but it does want to have enough mana in order to keep open for resources or for activating Eldrazi Displacer and or Angel of Condemnation when necessary. It also helps to stay ahead of the curve, so naturally the deck's running Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits to get that 3rd land on turn 2. These are amazing since they can cat any dual typed or triple typed land in the deck. The deck's also running Llanowar Elves, Fyndhorn Elves, Elvish Mystic, and Birds of Paradise. These mana dorks are amazing not only to accelerate the deck, but to also get +1/+1 counters placed on them when Yannik exiles that fatty. Putting a ton of counters on Birds of Paradise makes it a huge beater really early on in the game, allowing you to put pressure on the biggest threat at the table. Since mana diversification is important, the rest of the mana acceleration is from mana rocks. Arcane Signet, Golgari Signet, Orzhov Signet, Celestia Signet, Felwar Stone, Soul Ring, and Mana Crypt. Since the deck isn't competitive or turbo aggro, we have the breathing room of running these mana rocks since they're cheaper than our commander and can still help with a turn 3 Yannik. And even then, we don't always want a turn 3 Yannik since we'd rather have a fatty in play first before casting Yannik. Since the deck isn't about casting our commanders as quickly as possible, we can run these humbler rocks. If Mana Crypt is a card you don't have or can't acquire, just swap it out for another mana rock, no problem. Phyrexian Altar helps us get mana at the cost of sacrificing a creature. This is great in a pinch since we can draw a card if Nikara is on the battlefield, as well as giving us that extra oomph needed to cast a bigger creature if circumstances are dire. Or sacrificing Yannik to release whatever fatty was exiled by it in response to blocking. That can also provide a great Rattlesnake block. It can also be used to sacrifice a fatty before its drawback affects us. Gaia's Cradle is included because of all the creatures in the deck and most of the spells are green anyways, so it really helps out in accelerating the deck. However, like Mana Crypt, you can substitute it for Idlamok Cradle of the Sun if it's not within your price range. The rest of the deck is just the lands. The deck's running all 10 fetch lands, all 3 dual lands, all 3 shock lands, Command Tower, Mana Confluence, City of Brass, Exotic Orchard, Reflecting Pool, Bountiful Promenade, Ancient Tomb, Temple of the False God, Indatha Triome, and Murmuring Bosk, as well as 2 of each basic snow land in case opponents are running anything that benefits us for it. As with all of my deck techs, almost the entirety of the budget is in the mana base, so if you don't already have these cards or aren't building this on MTGO, you can very easily swap out the dual lands and enemy colored fetches for Horizon lands and Pain lands. This way you can save a ton on the deck. The most important thing is to always try to avoid playing lands that enter the battlefield tapped whenever you can. They really set you back. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Nikara and Yannik. I wanted to do something original with this partner pair that was a bit more on the casual side. The deck's about amassing huge fatties to swing in, overwhelming the table with tons of power. It takes advantage of huge creatures with a low casting cost, bypassing most of their drawbacks. If you're interested in the deck list of the spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.